Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be completely, utterly alone, staring into the face of impossible odds? January 11th, 1944. High above the frozen heart of Germany, a lone American pilot gripped the controls of his P-51 Mustang. His name was Major James Howard. His ammunition was dangerously low, his squadron scattered and lost in the chaos of battle. Below him, a wounded flock of B-17 bombers bled smoke and fire. And above, a wolf pack. 30, perhaps more, German fighters circling for the kill. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to save himself. But instead, he pushed the throttle forward. He lowered the nose of his Mustang and plunged alone into the heart of the swarm. What unfolded in the next 30 minutes would not only earn him the Medal of Honor, it would send a tremor of fear through the highest ranks of the Luftwaffe. This is the story of the day Germany's greatest pilots first truly understood what they were up against. This is the day they met the P-51 Mustang. For the first 2 years of the American daylight bombing campaign, the war in the skies over Europe followed a grim and predictable script. For the Luftwaffe, it was a strategy of chilling patience, a brutal, bloody waiting game. They knew, with the cold certainty of hunters, that the American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were leashed. These powerful fighters could shepherd the bomber streams to the German border, a ghost of a line drawn some 400 miles from the shores of England. But there, their fuel gauges would dip into the red. They had to turn back, or they would fall from the sky just as surely as the bombers they were meant to protect. And so the German fighter pilots would hold their formations back. They would circle like vultures, conserving fuel, conserving energy, watching the contrails of the American escorts etch their retreat across the stratosphere. And then they would pounce. The radio channels would crackle to life, the attack orders would be given, and the undefended bomber streams, lumbering towards their targets deep inside the Reich, would enter an abattoir made of steel and sky. It was a slaughter. Let's not mince words. The B-17 and B-24 crews of the 8th Air Force were being fed into a meat grinder. Mission loss rates would climb to 10, 15, sometimes a catastrophic 20%. Imagine that. 1 in every 5 aircraft, gone. 100 men vanished into the cold German air. The Luftwaffe aces, men like Heinz Spritzel-Beer and Walter Gulle-Uessau, were painting their rudders with victory marks, their kill counts soaring. It was for them a grim kind of target practice. The sky belonged to them. But then, in the bleak winter of December 1943, something new arrived on the rain-slicked airfields of England. It was a machine born of an unlikely alliance. A sleek, revolutionary American airframe married to the magnificent beating heart of a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was a true Allied masterpiece, a fusion of British engineering genius and American industrial might. It was a fighter that could fly farther, climb faster, and strike with more venom than anything the Luftwaffe had ever encountered. The P-51 Mustang had arrived. And for the proud pilots of the Jagdwaffe, the days of unchallenged dominance were about to come to a violent, shocking end. An unprecedented challenge was screaming towards them at over 400 miles per hour. Let me introduce you to the 354th Fighter Group. History would remember them as the Pioneer Mustang Group, and for good reason. They were the trailblazers, the first to unleash this new predator in the hostile skies of Europe. Their initial mission, on the 1st of December 1943, was deceptively gentle. A simple fighter sweep over the Belgian coast, a shakedown cruise, a chance for the pilots to feel the power of the Merlin engine, to learn the Mustang's unique personality, its quirks, its strengths. There was no contact with the enemy, no drama. Just the roar of 12 brand new engines over the grey waters of the Channel. But 12 days later, on December 13th, the script was torn to shreds. 49 P-51 Mustangs of the 354th lifted off from the muddy fields of their English base and did what was, until that moment, considered impossible. They escorted heavy bombers all the way to the docks of Kiel, Germany, deep, deep inside the Reich. The German air defense controllers watched their radar screens in confusion, then in alarm. Dozens of fighters were scrambled. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s clawed their way into the sky, their pilots confident, expecting the usual routine. They would climb, position themselves, and wait for the little friends, the American escorts, to peel off and run for home. Except they didn't. The contrails of the P-51s just kept coming, stretching ever deeper into German airspace. And when the German fighters finally committed to the attack, assuming the bombers were now defenseless, the Mustangs tore into them with a ferocity that was stunning. In that single, sprawling engagement, those 49 brand-new P-51s shot down 15 German aircraft. But that isn't the most stunning part of the story. The truly remarkable fact, the one that sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe High Command, was this: not one Mustang was lost. Think about that. Brand new pilots, flying a brand new fighter type on its first major combat mission, engaging experienced Luftwaffe veterans over their own territory. And they all came home. German squadron commanders, their formations shattered, were screaming frantic, disbelieving reports back to headquarters. Amerikanische Jäger bei 400 Meilen. Wiederhole. Jäger bei 400 Meilen. American fighters at 400 miles penetration. At first, the High Command simply refused to believe it. It couldn't be true. It had to be a navigational error on the part of their own pilots, or a gross misidentification. No Allied fighter possessed the range to penetrate that deep, engage in combat, and still have the fuel to make it home. It was a physical impossibility. But it was not an error. The P-51 with its external drop tanks had a combat radius of over 750 miles. Suddenly, a map of Europe looked terrifyingly different to the German leadership. Berlin, the very heart of the Third Reich, was 600 miles from England. It was now within range, and there was nowhere left for the Luftwaffe to hide. The arrival of the Mustang wasn't just a tactical shift. It was an earthquake that shattered the very foundations of German air strategy. Before the P-51s arrived in force, the average loss rate for an American bomber crew over Germany hovered between a grim 5 to 7% per mission. After the Mustangs began their deep escort duties, that number plummeted to under 2%. This wasn't just a statistic. It was life. It was the sudden, breathtaking silence on the intercom where a sister ship's crew used to be. It was the empty bunks in the barracks at night. And now that dreadful calculus was changing. The bomber crews knew it. They could feel it. They saw these sleek, graceful guardians sticking with them all the way to the target and all the way back. The Luftwaffe knew it too. The era of the uncontested kill was over. The balance of power in the sky had been fundamentally, irrevocably altered. And that brings us back to Major James Howard. He wasn't some fresh-faced rookie. He was a seasoned combat veteran, an alumnus of the legendary Flying Tigers, having tasted battle against the Japanese in the skies over China before transferring to the European theater. He was known for his quiet confidence, his ice-cold composure under pressure. And on January 11th, 1944, he was about to perform an act of such audacious, single-minded bravery that it would etch his name into legend. On that frigid morning, Howard was leading his 354th Fighter Group, 50 P-51 Mustangs in total, tasked with escorting 3 massive divisions of B-17 Flying Fortresses. Their target, the critical aircraft factories at Oschersleben, 100 miles southwest of Berlin. This was a vital artery of the German war machine, and the Allies were determined to sever it. The bomber stream was a colossal river of aluminum in the sky, over 600 B-17s and B-24s, and the Luftwaffe was waiting for them. As the bombers completed their run, the sky erupting with flak and smoke, and began the long, agonizing turn for home, the German fighters struck. They came in waves. Focke-Wulf 190s, their radial engines roaring, diving head-on. Agile Messerschmitt 109s coming in from the sun. Scores of them, a hornet's nest stirred to fury, using every tactic in their deadly playbook to shatter the bomber formations and pick off the stragglers. Howard's squadron, the 356th, was assigned to a different bomber group. But as he scanned the chaos, his eyes fixed on the distant 401st Bomb Group. They were being butchered. A swarm of at least 30 German fighters was tearing them to pieces. In that instant, Howard made a decision that defied all military logic. He keyed his radio. "You guys stay with the bombers," he commanded his squadron. "I'm going in." And then he dove, straight into the heart of the furball. What happened next is one of the most astonishing displays of individual valor in the history of aerial warfare. The swirling chaos of the dogfight, a three-dimensional blizzard of tracers, smoke, and glinting metal, swallowed him whole. In the confusion, Howard was immediately separated from the rest of his squadron. Suddenly, he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. One P-51 Mustang, one pilot, against 30, maybe more, enemy fighters. Below him, the B-17s of the 401st were dying. He could see their gunners flashing desperate signals, their engines trailing black plumes of oil and fire. Hundreds of American airmen, trapped in their aluminum coffins, were seconds from oblivion if someone, anyone, didn't do something. So he attacked. For the next 30 minutes, an eternity in air combat, James Howard fought a private war against an entire German fighter formation. He became a phantom, a silver ghost of vengeance. He dove through their attack runs, his 650 caliber machine guns chattering, forcing them to break off their pursuit of the bombers. He engaged fighters that were closing in for the kill, drawing their fire onto himself. He was a sheepdog protecting a wounded flock from a pack of ravenous wolves. The surviving bomber crews, watching in stunned disbelief from their turrets, reported seeing him perform impossible feats. They swore that when his guns eventually ran dry, he simply used his aircraft as a weapon, appearing to physically ram a German fighter to keep it off a crippled B-17, though this detail was never officially confirmed. He used every trick he had learned over China. Every ounce of skill, every drop of courage. He became the one-man air force. When it was finally over, when the last of the German fighters, battered and bewildered, broke away, Howard limped back toward England. His fuel tanks were nearly empty. His ammunition was completely gone. His plane was battered. But the 401st Bomb Group was, for the most part, safe. The bomber crew's radios were screaming with one frantic, awestruck question. Who was that guy? Who was that P-51 pilot? Nobody knew. It took days for the 8th Air Force to piece together the reports and identify the lone wolf as Major Howard. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the entire European theater of operations to receive it for a single air-to-air combat mission. But the real impact of his action was psychological. The German pilots who survived that day went back to their bases with a terrifying story. There was a new American fighter in the sky, and it was flown by pilots who were not just skilled but who simply would not back down. So now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Beyond the legends and the statistics, what did Germany's finest fighter pilots, the Experten, actually say about the P-51 Mustang? First, let's clear the air and address a famous, and often misunderstood, quotation. You have probably heard the story about Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most celebrated aces, with 104 confirmed victories, a man who would eventually command the entire Luftwaffe fighter force. The anecdote goes that the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, once furiously asked him what he needed to win the air war. Galland, in a moment of sheer audacity, is said to have replied, "A squadron of Spitfires." This story is true. But context is everything. This exchange happened in September of 1940, during the height of the Battle of Britain, 3 full years before the P-51 even saw combat over Europe. Galland wasn't claiming the Spitfire was a superior fighter to his own Messerschmitt Bf-109. He was making a sharp, sarcastic tactical point. The Bf-109 was designed as a high-speed, offensive interceptor, a master of the boom and zoom attack. But Göring was stubbornly forcing his pilots to fly slow, close escort missions for the bombers, a role that completely negated the 109's strengths and made them vulnerable. The British Spitfire was a more agile, maneuverable dogfighter, better suited to the defensive turning battles that close escort demanded. So Galland's comment was a piece of gallows humor, a jab at his commander's flawed strategy. In reality, he much preferred his 109. But when he and his pilots first encountered the P-51s swarming over Germany in late 1943 and early 1944, that was an entirely different conversation. The Mustang presented a danger on a completely different scale. Firstly, and most terrifyingly, was the range. With its external drop tanks, the P-51D could make a round trip of over 1,600 miles. This gave it a combat radius of roughly 750 miles. For the Luftwaffe, this was a strategic nightmare. There was no turn-back point anymore. The Mustangs could go all the way. Second was speed and altitude. The definitive P-51D model, arriving in the spring of 1944, boasted a top speed of nearly 440 miles per hour and could operate effectively at altitudes over 40,000 feet. It could catch almost anything the Luftwaffe could put in the air. Third, and perhaps most psychologically draining for the German pilots, was its endurance to hunt. The P-51 didn't just escort bombers and go home. It could loiter. After the bombers were safe, the Mustangs would stay, lingering over Germany for 30-45 minutes, sometimes longer, actively hunting. Luftwaffe training schools, transport aircraft, planes taking off or landing at their own airfields. Nothing and nowhere was safe. Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe general and ace who flew nearly 1,000 combat missions, stated unequivocally after the war that the Mustang was the most dangerous opponent his pilots faced. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, the most dangerous. The brutal, unvarnished truth, which German aces would only fully admit after the war, was that even if the aircraft themselves were evenly matched, which by mid-1944 they were not, the Americans held an advantage that was simply insurmountable. Pilot training. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was in a desperate state. Crippling fuel shortages meant that training programs were slashed to the bone. A new German pilot might be thrown into the inferno of the air war with as little as 30 to 50 hours of total flight time. American pilots, by contrast, arrived in England with a minimum of 200 to 300 hours. Many had far more. They were better trained in gunnery, in formation flying, in navigation, and in combat tactics. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in all of history, with an astonishing 352 confirmed kills, said that from 1943 onward, a new German pilot facing a new American pilot in a P-47 or a P-51 was, quite simply, a sitting duck. The skill gap had become a chasm. Now, compound that with sheer overwhelming numbers. By the summer of 1944, the Americans were dispatching formations of 500, 600, sometimes 800 P-51 Mustangs on a single day's mission. German pilots climbing to intercept would look up and see a sky filled with enemy fighters from horizon to horizon. Günther Rall, the third highest scoring ace of all time with 275 victories, confessed in post-war interviews that by mid-1944, encountering P-51s had turned German fighter missions into suicide. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They were everywhere, he recalled, a statement echoed by countless of his comrades. It wasn't just that the P-51 was a superior fighter. It was that the Americans possessed thousands of them, flown by exceptionally well-trained pilots, fueled by a seemingly limitless supply of gasoline, and backed by the single greatest industrial economy the world had ever seen. The numbers paint a stark, brutal picture. In 1943, before the Mustang's arrival in force, the Luftwaffe remained deadly effective on defense. For every German fighter they lost, they were shooting down 4 or 5 Allied bombers. By July 1944, a mere 7 months after the P-51s began their deep escort missions, that ratio had catastrophically flipped. The Luftwaffe was losing fighters at a rate of 3 or 4 to 1 against them. They weren't just losing the air war, they were being systematically annihilated. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the day of the most critical battle of the war in the West, the once mighty Luftwaffe managed to fly a paltry 319 sorties over the invasion beaches. The Allies, by contrast, flew over 14,000. Let that number sink in. The German Air Force could barely offer token resistance over the fight for Europe's destiny. Why? Because for the 6 months prior, the P-51s had been hunting them into extinction. They had strafed their airfields, shot down their trainers, destroyed their fuel depots, and killed their irreplaceable instructors. The P-51 didn't just win dogfights, it was the tip of a spear that broke the Luftwaffe's back. Hannes Trautloft, a veteran ace and Geschwader Commodore, famously wrote in his diary in early 1944 after first witnessing vast formations of P-51s over Germany. "When I saw the Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." He wasn't afraid of a one-on-one dogfight. But he was a realist. He understood that Germany could never match the numbers, the pilot training, the fuel, or the industrial capacity that the Mustang represented. After the war, in quiet conversations over a drink where former enemies could speak as fellow pilots, the German aces were remarkably candid. They respected the P-51's design, they acknowledged its deadly effectiveness, but above all, they saw it as the symbol of what had truly defeated them. So, was the P-51 Mustang the best fighter of World War II? That's a complex question. In terms of pure, raw performance in specific areas, perhaps not. The late war German Ta-152 had superior high-altitude performance. The revolutionary Me-262 jet was in a class of its own for speed. The British Spitfire Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was arguably a more agile dogfighter. But what the German aces knew in their bones was that war isn't fought in a vacuum. It isn't a series of one-on-one duels. The P-51 was the right fighter, at the right time, in the right numbers, doing the right job. It was relatively cheap, costing around $50,000 per plane. North American aviation churned them out at a staggering rate, building over 15,000 during the war. It was reliable, a machine pilots could trust to fly for 8 hours over hostile territory and bring them home. And it had the one capability that mattered most: the range to escort bombers to any target in Germany, destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground, and secure total air supremacy. The German aces fought with incredible bravery and skill. Men like Hartmann and Barkhorn achieved victory totals that defy belief. But they were fighting a rising tide with a bucket, and they knew it. The P-51 didn't win the air war because it was invincible. It won because there were thousands of them, flown by well-trained men, backed by a nation that could outproduce, outtrain, and outlast its enemy. When the Luftwaffe aces first faced the P-51 Mustang in late 1943, their reaction was a cocktail of shock, grudging respect, and deep existential dread. They knew in that moment that the rules of the game had been rewritten, and that the balance of power had decisively, permanently shifted against them. They weren't cowards. They were among the finest pilots the world has ever known. But even they could not hold back the storm. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was the fighter that broke their will and their ability to defend Germany from the air. The next time you see the elegant silver shape of a Mustang, remember what it represented to the men who had to face it. They respected it. They feared it. And deep down they knew that once it arrived in force, the war was lost.
Thank you for listening. Please share your thoughts, like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe for more.